The brain of Hollywood child star Bridgette Andersen was already dead when the doctors made this harrowing decision. They decided to disconnect her from life support. At that moment, she was only 21 years old. What led the once famous Hollywood actress to such a tragic end at such a young age? This is the story of Bridgette Andersen's heartbreaking fate. Behind the Spotlight. On July 11th, 1975, in the California town of Inglewood, a child was born who would later conquer Hollywood. Bridgette Andersen was an ordinary girl from a middle-class family, but her sunny smile and natural charm made her special from the very first days of her life. She was a star whose brilliance was yet to be revealed. The Andersen family couldn't boast of luxury, but their home was always filled with an atmosphere of love and support. Bridgette's parents, despite financial limitations, were willing to do whatever it took to help their daughter follow her dream. They carefully watched as their little girl eagerly embraced new roles. She was born to be an actress, her parents later admitted. Their unwavering belief in her became a strong foundation for Bridgette's first steps into the world of art. The parents noticed one unique trait. As soon as she learned to speak, she began reciting lines from movies, and her first stage was a household mirror, in front of which she performed entire plays. By the age of 3, she wasn't just memorizing lines, but also astonishingly accurately conveying the emotions of characters. Her parents realized they were raising an extraordinary child whose talent couldn't be ignored. This little girl was already dreaming of a big future, though she had no idea just how bright and challenging it would turn out to be. Having enrolled in acting courses before her peers had even learned to properly write their names, Bridgette found herself in an environment where adults set the rules. This taught her independence, but also deprived her of the childhood so vital for building connections with peers. Her first auditions became a true school of life. On one hand, there were the admiring looks of directors, amazed by her natural charisma. On the other, there were the painful rejections that taught her humility. It was during this time that a defining trait began to form in her, the determination to never give up, no matter what. But this success came at a price. Constant relocations, changing schools, and a lack of stable friendships created a sense of isolation. Paradoxically, the girl with a bright future often felt lonely. Perhaps this was the first warning sign. Despite the visible adoration of the public and the support of her parents, Bridgette felt the heavy burden of expectations from an early age. Her achievements in acting weren't seen just as her victories, but also as a chance for her family to achieve financial stability. If you work hard, Dad will buy a nice car. The first step toward fame, working in commercials and television, turned out to be far more challenging than it seemed. The children's entertainment industry demanded the maximum, even from its youngest actors. Fierce competitions, strict schedules, endless rehearsals, and constant pressure became a test for every child. But for Bridgette, it meant something even more. She was terrified of disappointing her family.
They used to read handfuls read to me when I was little, and I used to really get into the place and feel like I was.
The adults expected brilliant results from her. Behind the glittering sets of film productions, there was a small child who felt fear. Fear that if she made a mistake, everyone's dreams would crumble like a house of cards. And there was a good reason for this fear. Bridgette's teenage years were far from the typical adolescent story. While her peers were discovering the world of first crushes, parties, and friendships, she was rehearsing scenes, memorizing lines, and rushing between film sets. Her life was lived in the spotlight, and while she seemed to have the attention of her peers, it often felt shallow and superficial. The irony of her situation was that behind the glow of fame lay a deep sense of isolation. Her youth was unlike anyone else's. Deprived of the time and opportunity to build genuine friendships, Bridgette often felt lonely. She longed for the simple joys that others took for granted. But to her, they seemed out of reach. After her breakout role in Savannah Smiles in 1982, where her performance was truly groundbreaking, Bridgette skyrocketed to the height of fame. Her smile captivated audiences and her talent won over critics. She became a recognizable figure in Hollywood, a child star adored by the public. But fame, as it turned out, was a double-edged sword. In the eyes of adults, she was no longer a child. She'd become an investment, an actress from whom another hit was expected. Her celebrity status robbed her of the right to make mistakes or show weakness. Behind the scenes, the youngster had to find her place in a world that saw her primarily as a source of income. Bridgette continued to delight audiences with her roles in projects such as the biographical TV film Mae West, the drama The Underachievers, and The Poignant Between Two Women. However, each step on this path brought her closer to a fundamental question. Who was she outside of her roles? This battle between the inner child, longing for simple joys, and the outward star, forced to meet relentless expectations, began to consume Bridgette from within. The fame she achieved at such a young age became both a blessing and a curse. The packed filming schedules, endless rehearsals, and the constant need to be perfect began to turn into an unbearable burden. Hollywood demanded the impossible from her, being an adult in a child's body. The life that millions of her fans dreamed of was becoming a cage for Bridgette herself. Her freedom dissolved into schedules and public obligations. Then, the ugly truth started to emerge. By the mid-1980s, rumors of Bridgette's first struggles began to appear in the press. Reporters discussed her attempts to cope with anxiety and the immense pressure weighing on her shoulders. At times, she missed filming days, which drew the ire of producers. To the general public, all of this was framed as star syndrome. The press, which had once praised her talent, now accused her of immaturity and diva behavior. This shift from admiration to condemnation was a heavy blow for the young actress. Behind the scenes, her mother tried to shield her from the growing problems. But in Hollywood, where every move of a star is scrutinized under a microscope, it was almost impossible. What was once personal became public, and her mistakes became the subject of discussion for millions. She was surrounded by agents, producers, and PR managers who saw her not as a child, but as a source of profit. Her life increasingly became a carefully calculated schedule. Contracts, filming, promotional campaigns, everything was designed with one goal: to extract the maximum from her talent. Yet no one stopped to consider what it felt like to be a young girl who saw herself merely as a tool for the success of others. But all things come to an end. By her teenage years, Bridgette began to realize that her star no longer shone as brightly as it once had. The world of show business is ruthless to those who grew up in the public eye. The sweet little girl from the screen of yesterday was now confronted with fierce competition and the looming question of who she would become next. Her fame was fading, and with it came a sense of emptiness. Bridgette began asking questions she had never considered before. Who am I really? Is there life beyond the roles I play? This crisis tormented her, intensifying the inner struggle she was already facing. Stress, pressure, and confusion pushed Bridgette onto a path that had proven tragic for many of her peers in Hollywood. Even as a teenager, she began seeking solace in alcohol and drugs. Her friends recalled how often she appeared downcast, though few realized the depth of her suffering. The smile that had once captured the hearts of millions was becoming increasingly rare. For Bridgette, returning to the screen became a dream that had turned into a battle. She wanted to prove to everyone, and perhaps most of all, to herself, that her talent extended beyond her roles as a child prodigy. But Hollywood was ruthless. Her audition for teenage roles often ended in rejection. Directors and producers no longer saw her as the girl who had captivated audiences just a few years earlier. Bridgette no longer fit their vision. Despite the decline in her career, the name Bridgette Andersen remained for many a symbol of exceptional talent. Fans who once laughed and cried because of her performances continued to express their admiration. Her mailbox was filled with letters from viewers around the world. In them, people wrote about how her work had helped them through difficult times, how her characters had inspired them and brought them joy. For Bridgette, these letters were a glimmer of light in her challenging journey. In her personal life, however, things remained bleak. She didn't have. Bridgette Andersen was never married, and her personal life remained behind the scenes of her public career. Her early years spent on film sets deprived her of the chance to experience ordinary teenage crushes and romantic adventures. She was introverted and simply didn't have the time to build personal connections. Behind the glamorous exterior was a fragile soul, searching for but never finding true closeness. The demons still wouldn't let Bridgette go. One of the most tragic aspects of Bridgette's life was her struggle with addiction, which began during her teenage years. Rumors of her drug dependency quickly spread through Hollywood, turning the talented actress into a subject of condemnation. The public, which had once admired her talent, now turned away without considering what might have driven the young star down this path. The pressures of fame, loneliness, and the toxic environment around her formed a destructive combination. The only people who could have helped her, her parents, did not. Bridgette's relationship with her parents, who had once been her main support during childhood, began to deteriorate in her teenage years. When her addiction became apparent, her family tried to help. Her parents felt guilty, believing that her early career was the root of her struggles. However, their attempts to save Bridgette often were met with resistance. She became increasingly distant, and the conflicts only deepened the rift between her and her family. They tried desperately to bring their daughter back, but the young star, consumed by her own pain, drifted further and further away. Her loneliness grew stronger with each passing year. While her peers moved forward, building new careers or families, Bridgette remained stuck in the past, where everything seemed lost. There were few people left in her circle who could offer her support. Hollywood, which once celebrated her talent, had abandoned her. Even when she was surrounded by crowds, Bridgette felt alone, as if her place in the world no longer existed. Despite the difficult circumstances, Bridgette tried to fight. She sought help through rehabilitation programs, attempting to overcome her addiction and rediscover herself outside of show business. But every new attempt was overshadowed by relapses. This battle drained her both physically and emotionally. She felt guilty for her failures, but continued to cling to hope. Bridgette's life had become an endless uphill battle, where every step forward was accompanied by a fall. Even amidst the darkness of her life, there were still glimmers of light. Encounters with devoted fans, who still remembered and loved her for her roles, brought her genuine joy. Memories of the best moments on set, when she was at the peak of her fame, occasionally reminded her of her own worth. Bridgette remained a person whose warmth still sparkled, despite all her mistakes. Those who met her in person often described her as a kind and radiant soul, someone who made tremendous strength behind her fragility. Fans understood and accepted that she would never return to the heights of fame she once achieved. Her efforts to quit using substances, despite her genuine desire to turn her life around, often ended in failure. Rehabilitation centers became temporary refuges, but returning to her familiar environment erased any progress she had made. Her social circle, friends, and acquaintances often exasperated her struggles. Instead of offering support, she was met with indifference and even betrayal. Some of those who were supposed to stand by her only pushed her deeper into the abyss, as they themselves were struggling with addiction. This turned her fight not only into a battle against addiction, but also into a war against a world around her that left less and less room for hope. By the mid-1990s, Bridgette had almost completely disappeared from the public eye. Her career had faded. Her final project was a black and white Pepsi commercial in 1996, which went largely unnoticed by the public. It was her last attempt to remind the world of herself, but the show business industry had already closed its door to the once brilliant star. Her financial situation also deteriorated sharply. The savings she had accumulated during her childhood were gone, and she no longer had a stable income. Bridgette found herself in a situation where she relied on others, and sometimes lived in conditions far removed from the life of fame she once knew. The image of a star who once lit up the screen had now transformed into someone desperately struggling to survive. Bridgette's relationships with her family and friends were completely destroyed. She lacked both the strength and desire to repair them. One obsessive desire consumed her: to use again. Her parents, who had once been her greatest support in childhood, now felt utterly powerless. They tried to help her, but their efforts were met with resistance. She increasingly avoided public events and had practically disappeared from the public eye. Hollywood, which had once marveled at her talent, didn't even notice her absence. Bridgette spent her time in isolation, far from the spotlight that had once been her home. By the end of her life, Bridgette Andersen found herself in a state of deep personal crisis. Once adored by millions, she lived in isolation, almost completely detached from the world that had once been her stage. Her health deteriorated rapidly due to years of substance abuse. Bridgette no longer appeared in public, and the few who still remembered her regarded her as a symbol of a talent that had faded far too soon. For those who observed her from a distance, witnessing the slow decline of the once brilliant star who had lit up screens was unbearable, even for those who had barely known her. One day, Bridgette was hospitalized at the Queen of Angels Hospital following an overdose of drugs and alcohol. Doctors fought to save her life, but her brain was already unresponsive. A few hours later, Bridgette was disconnected from life support. On May 8, 1997, the world lost Bridgette Andersen. She was only 21 years old. Her death came as a shock to those who remembered her as the bright, charming girl from the screen. News of her tragic passing spread instantly across all media outlets. The public was overwhelmed with regret over how such an undeniable talent had been unable to escape the destructive grip of addiction and inner turmoil. Her untimely death not only shook her fans, but also served as a stark reminder of how difficult the journey can be for child stars who struggle to find their place in the world after the spotlight fades. Bridgette Andersen left far too soon, but her life and work remain in the memory of those who were captivated by her talent. Journalists raise questions about the cruelty of an industry that elevates young stars only to abandon them to fend for themselves. However, this wave of discussion quickly subsided, replaced by other news stories. Many of her former colleagues expressed their sorrow over her passing. They remembered her as a kind, radiant, and genuine person whose smile could light up any room. But their words came too late. No one had been able to stop the destructive path that had led her to a premature death. The contrast between her childhood stardom and her obscurity at such a young age was striking and tragic. After her passing, The image of Bridgette Andersen remained forever tied to her most famous role in the film Savannah Smiles. For millions of viewers, she will always be remembered as that little girl with the radiant smile, capable of melting even the coldest of hearts. However, behind this on-screen image lay a real life filled with pain, struggles, and challenges that most viewers never knew about. Her story serves as a warning about the fragility of human life under the heavy weight of fame. Her smile, despite all the hardships, still lives on in our hearts. Rest in peace, Bridgette Andersen.